Today we are going to talk about carbon credit markets with Dr. Nathan Hendricks and Micah Cameron-Harp. Unfortunately, Nathan is not able to join us today, but Micah is going to take on this presentation as he has done many times before. But I am going to give you a brief bio for both Dr. Nathan Hendricks and for Micah Cameron-Harp. Dr. Nathan Hendricks Hendricks's research program focuses on production economics, agricultural policy, and the interaction between agriculture and the environment. A significant portion of his work is related to the economics of land and water. Dr. Hendricks teaches Ag Act 315, Contemporary Issues in Global Food and Agricultural Systems, and Ag Act 810, Price, Income, and Trade Policies in Agriculture. Micah Cameron-Harp is a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Agricultural Economics. He joined the department in the fall of 2019 as part of the Rural Resource Resiliency NRT project. His research focuses on sustainability issues at the intersection of agricultural production and natural resource management. Currently, his projects concern groundwater management and the emerging agricultural carbon credit market. Micah received his MS in sustainability from Arizona State University and his BS from Cornell University in natural resources. As mentioned before, unfortunately, Dr. Hendricks won't be able to join us, but Micah has done this many times before in many different arenas. So I'm going to pass on the presentation to Micah so he can share his screen.
All right. Okay, can everybody see my slides now?
Yes, we can, Micah. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, and thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Micah Cameron-Harp. I'm just about to start my fourth year in the Agricultural Economics PhD program at Kansas State. And this is a subject that I really enjoyed talking about. I usually give this presentation or a similar version of it to extension audiences in different counties in Kansas. And today I'm really excited to get to hear your thoughts as well, coming from all the different backgrounds that sounds like our audience has. So the purpose of this presentation is to give you a little bit of an intro into what the carbon credit market looks like in the agricultural space right now, maybe answer some of your questions about what this market looks like, why does it exist, and then also some practical questions for those of you perhaps who are producers, trying to answer a question like, should I start carbon farming? Or which program or company should I work with? These are questions that hopefully today I can help you answer, although I won't be able to give you a hard and fast answer. Questions that I am very well equipped to answer are things like, what are carbon credits, carbon markets, what determines their price? That's a big question for us economists. And then what are the current opportunities that exist and what might be some pros and cons of them? I would like to say at any point in the presentation, if somebody has a question, please feel free to put it in the chat and or just pipe up and ask it. I would rather have questions as we go along so that we know everybody's on the same page. Yeah, so please do interrupt me if anything is unclear to you. All right, so let's start out with a very important question in the formation of a market. Who's paying for carbon credits and why? The answer is that this is really driven by corporate climate pledges. This is a voluntary market, and companies like Cargill, for instance, PepsiCo, and Microsoft have made these large commitments to their stakeholders that they're going to make some type of reduction in their carbon emissions or offset the emissions that they create during their life cycle of their business. And to do that, they need to purchase some type of credit or offset. So if you look at Microsoft, for instance, they've actually committed to being carbon negative by 2030, meaning that they're going to remove or sequester more carbon or purchase carbon credits that do that than they are going to emit in their operations. The other term you might hear is something called carbon insets, and that's going to be if the change in practice or sequestration occurs within the business itself. So if, let's say, Cargill within their business makes some change that now sequesters carbon, that would be an inset, whereas an offset is something that you would purchase from another entity. All right. Just to give you an idea of what this market looks like right now, we have our buyers, like I just mentioned, McDonald's, Pepsi, Microsoft, and even private individuals too, who are buying these carbon credits to offset their emissions. Again, this is purely voluntary. The next group is intermediaries, or these are market facilitators. Some of these companies you might have heard of or heard in the news, Nori, Indigo, Ecosystem Services Market Consortium is one that is started here or operating in Kansas, so I include it. And these are going to be the companies that match up our buyers and people demanding carbon credits with the producers of carbon credits. And those are going to be in the agricultural space or our farmers, right? These are going to be individuals which implement some practice or change something in their management that sequesters carbon in the soil or reduces greenhouse gas emissions. Both of these activities currently exist in the carbon market space for agriculture. So in one situation, sequestering carbon, we are taking carbon out of the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis, and then sequestering it by having that carbon eventually end up in the soil sink and stay there for some period of time. The alternative is that we have a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So this would be something like using precision nitrogen applications so that less nitrogen volatilizes and becomes nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. Both of those things, prevention of emissions and actual sequestration, fall within this market that we're discussing today. So far, any questions? Okay. I mentioned earlier the question of what determines their price. And like any good, the price is highly dependent on quality. So when I went and purchased a chainsaw recently, I used to be a tree climber before I came back from my PhD, and the chainsaws at the company I work for are all Stihl brand, and they're a little bit more expensive. And so when I was justifying this purchase, I said, well, it's the quality that we're buying. The chainsaw is going to run well, and I'm not going to have to repair it often. And so that's why I sprung for the more expensive chainsaw. Similarly, with carbon credits, we have certain things which are going to determine their quality. And there are these four main characteristics. The first is additionality. Second is permanence. Third, leakage. And the fourth, uncertainty. So as a visual learner, I've made some diagrams here to hopefully help us understand these. And it's important to do that because ultimately these are going to determine the type of program perhaps that a producer might be interested in or the characteristics of that. So what is additionality? Well, additionality is something we discussed when we're talking about whether the sequestration would have occurred in the absence of any program existing. So in the first case here in the top, we have some forested land. Before we enrolled, then we enrolled, it's still forested. Yes, there might be additional carbon that's sequestered, but that carbon isn't additional, right? We didn't make any change, which is now associated with greater carbon sequestration. In the bottom case, though, we have, let's say, some cropland that we've now converted into a forested plot. That would fulfill this additionality criteria, right? Because we have some type of marked measurable change, which is going to increase sequestration. And that sequestration wouldn't have occurred in the absence of the program encouraging this shift. Now, in general, I'll say that conversion of cropland to forested land is not something that is encouraged in the carbon credit space, and that's for one of the later topics, leakage. I'll come back to that in a second. So the second characteristic or criteria that we're concerned about is permanence. So let's say in this instance, we start off and we're just row cropping like usual, and we decide, how about we're going to try no-till? Right? So we switch and we start doing no-till for the next decade. But then for whatever reason, we have to sell the plot of land that we were farming, and another producer buys it, and they want to switch back to conventional till. That carbon, which we sequestered in the soil over 10 years of doing no-till, is now exposed to oxygen and will decompose, and will a portion of it be emitted back into the atmosphere. So this is this permanence concern, right? How long is the carbon we sequester actually going to stick around in the soil? You can think from one of the buyer's perspectives. If I'm going to buy a carbon credit, I want to know that that credit is associated with something that's actually going to stick around in the soil. Because I'm going to stack it up against my emissions, the next 10 years. I don't want something that potentially is going to just be re-emitted in the short term. Leakage is the concern I mentioned earlier with converting cropland to forested land. So let's say, for instance, in the US, we have a program where we're going to compensate producers for retiring cropland and putting it in forests. Globally, the demand for food crops is still going to be quite similar to what it was. And so there's now an incentive, perhaps, to replenish the lost production which occurred because we moved this cropland into forested land. So perhaps down in South America and the Amazon, there's now a greater incentive for somebody to cut down some of the rainforest and start growing crops there instead. This would be highly undesirable because the amount of carbon that is sequestered in the Amazon rainforest is going to be much greater than what we gain from converting cropland to forested land in a temperate setting. So this is the idea of leakage, that if we don't select our practices and programs carefully, perhaps there could be some type of unintended consequence which completely dissipates any benefits from local activities. And then lastly, we have uncertainty. So I'll bring up some maps here in a second, and we'll discuss this more in a broader context. But just to throw this question out there to get you thinking, there's a ton of variability, even within soils in Kansas, right? And even within a single person's field. Perhaps on one side of the field, the soil is a little bit sandier. The other side is a little bit more heavy in clay. But as a intermediary in this market, I need to come up with a single estimate of how much carbon is sequestered for a activity, let's say cover cropping, for instance. So I know this producer switches into cover cropping. I have a rough idea of what his soils look like, but am I going to say that he's actually sequestering, say, 0.22, this is tons of carbon equivalents per acres per year, or on the low end, 0.15 tons of carbon per acre per year. For the producer, that matters a lot, right? Because this could potentially determine the payment he gets from participating. But it also is going to matter a lot to the buyer, because we don't want really uncertain or estimate of what we're paying for. We want to know if we're paying that for 5 tons of carbon sequestered, that's actually what's occurring on the ground. Just to illustrate this a little bit more, here are a couple examples from in Kansas. So in this chart here, we have the practice that we're adopting in this scenario, the site conditions where we're adopting it, and then the estimated payment per acre per year. And we're going to assume that right now this producer is getting $15 per ton of CO2 sequestered, which is a pretty typical price in the US. So in this first case, we have a warm, dry climate, and that's going to be the same, right? Both of these, let's say both these producers quite nearby, so they're going to have the same precipitation and the same temperature throughout the year. One of them, however, has loamier, siltier, clayey soil. The other has the sandy soil. And if you look, that can be the difference of 55 cents per acre per year, which doesn't seem like a lot. But if you're farming 1,000 acres, suddenly that's a much bigger sum. Now, let's consider another scenario. Both of these producers in Heston, Kansas, they're both going to be doing no-till. That's what this NT stands for. They're both adopting cover cropping, but one of them is going to cover crop with late soybeans into winter wheat sorghum. The other is going to use sun hemp into winter wheat sorghum. In this case, the difference per acre per year is $4. And this is a pretty massive change when you then extrapolate that up to a much larger acreage. The reason for this is that one of the greatest determinants of below ground CO2 sequestration is above ground biomass. So if you have a plant like sun hemp, which is a lot more material above ground, the carbon that gets sequestered when it then enters the soil is going to be much greater. However, I like this example because late soybeans, potentially you could harvest those as well. So even though your sequestration payment that you get from this hypothetical program is smaller, your overall return for your entire season of production might be higher. So what are our main takeaways from this illustration? First is that your site conditions, where you're operating, where this producer is located, and their management, both past and present, are the main determinants of sequestration. And ultimately, in many cases, this is also going to determine your payment. So I've mapped out here average reductions or average sequestrations in CO2 equivalents for changing tillage. And I've done this by taking the average from scenarios where you switch from conventional to no-till or conventional to reduced till. So this is kind of an average estimate for if you just make some reduction in tillage frequency. If you look on some areas, we have 0.6 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per acre per year. At $15, that's going to be $9 per acre per year. Where in other areas, we're going to have something like $1.50 per acre per year. And this is solely due to the growing conditions that these producers are experiencing. So places like the Corn Belt, where there's plenty of precipitation, right, and great growing conditions. Well, like I said before, greatest determinant of below ground CO2 is above ground biomass. Those same areas which benefit from great growing conditions are also the most likely to sequester a lot of carbon. Now, if we look at cover cropping, it's a very different picture. So cover cropping, we see that the greatest reduction in CO2 or CO2 sequestration is actually around the Mississippi River and the counties that funnel water into that Mississippi River delta. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to why that would be the case? I'll watch the chat here for a couple seconds. Don't have any brave individuals? That's all right. So one of the largest benefits of cover cropping, number one, is going to be that you reduce erosion, which is going to be a big concern if you're in a floodplain. But two, cover crops a lot of times are going to add nitrogen into the soil, so you can reduce your nitrogen application. That means that you have less nitrogen that is flowing off your soil, right, and volatilizing and becoming nitrous oxide emissions. That is going to be most likely to occur in areas with rice production or that are frequently flooded. And so that's why we see the benefits concentrated here in the Mississippi River Delta. The other thing that I like to point out about this map is that there are some areas where cover cropping may actually result in emissions of CO2 rather than sequestration. In those areas, it could be the case that the climate is such that the likelihood of any carbon persisting in the soil is very low. So it's really important to understand the agronomic conditions where producers are operating when we think about adoption of these practices. Okay. The next thing I want to touch on here is, well, how do we actually come up with a number? How does a potential intermediary, like let's say Indigo, decide how much carbon was sequestered and what the payment should be? And the answer is that pretty much every program uses a model and measure approach. So first, they're going to take in a whole bunch of information like production practices, past history of the farm, and then they're going to use a process-based model like Sentry or DNVC to simulate what's going to occur within the soil and then come up with an estimate of what the carbon sequestration is. Then in some cases, they'll also use site-specific soil samples to either validate the model outputs or adjust them. So this is highly dependent on the program itself. Not all programs do this. And it also can vary in whether this is a cost that's borne by the intermediary or by the individual. So in some cases, you're free to provide those soil samples, but you are going to pay to take them. So this is a consideration that I always like to bring up. It's also important to know that the reality of what's occurring on the ground and the estimate that gets provided, there might be some disconnect there. As the scale of analysis gets bigger, our estimates get a lot better. But at very fine scale, it can be very tough to do that accurately. The thing I always like to tell producers is if you go out and you take a soil sample in one of your fields, and then you walk 50 feet away, even within the same field, and pull the same, use the same soil sampler, pull another sample, the chances of those two soil samples being identical is almost zero, right? Our soils vary so much. And so the model is trying to come up with an average across this really varied environment. And that's why there can sometimes be that mismatch. Okay, so now the program has that you're participating in, or this hypothetical producer is spitting out some number, and they say, this is what you're going to get. Well, that may not always be the case. It's an oversimplification on my part. Now, what I'd like to do is show what this actually looks like in a couple different programs. And I've broken this down because there are a couple main designs that exist right now. So in some cases, the program is going to pay a producer based on the practices they adopt and the given amount of acreage. So we call these payment for practice programs. And Bayer here is an example of this. So in Bayer's program, they don't measure how much carbon is sequestered. Instead, they're going to pay a set amount, $3 per acre per year, for no-till or strip-till adoption after January 1st, 2012, $6 for cover cropping, or $9 for adopting both of these practices. Again, this is a payment per practice program. And Bayer's doing this because they're stacking these up against their own offsets. So, or excuse me, against their own emissions. So to Bayer, on average, as long as the sequestration ends up being what they predict, then they can use them to offset their emissions. Alternatively, we have a program like Indigos, where instead they're going to ask producers to provide historical data on what they've been doing as far as the management of their soil and their operation, their applications of nutrients, and a variety of practices. And then they're going to use that to estimate how much carbon is sequestered and pay a set amount per ton of CO2 sequestered. So the last I checked, Indigo was $15 per ton of CO2. So it's really important for a producer to understand their agronomic conditions, because in one of these programs, right, let's say in Bayer's, you could sequester very little carbon and get paid on a per acre basis for adopting a practice which has agronomic benefits. So it could be the case that no-till doesn't add a lot of carbon to the soil because of where you farm in Kansas, but it is valuable because it improves your soil quality and for all the reasons which producers have been adopting it. If that same producer joined Indigo's program, however, they might get very little, if any, compensation for adopting those practices because the CO2 sequestration modeled for them is extremely low. So these are the type of considerations that I think are important to think out. And when we then discuss whether enrolling is a good idea or where we think producers are going to enroll in certain programs, these are the type of questions that we ask. Nori, I include here, it's very similar to Indigo's model, except they are one of the companies that don't require or use soil sampling, but it can be provided by the producer. So in Nori's case, let's say you input all your data and they model that you're sequestering 5 tons of CO2 per acre per year. And you have soil samples that say, actually, you're sequestering 10. They'll meet you halfway if you provide those soil samples. So that's kind of an example of one which there might be some reason to do soil sampling, even if you bear the cost. And then lastly, there are some programs like Carbon Now, which is by Locus Ag, where they have a product that they're selling for other reasons, a soil probiotic in this case, which is supposed to boost yields because it improves nitrogen, the nitrogen cycle occurring within the soil, boosts available nitrogen. Then there's also these ancillary benefits of carbon sequestration. And so they quantify those and essentially you get a discount on their product because of the carbon sequestration benefits. Lastly, I just mentioned these because Corteva is an example of a common practice, which is to ask producers to commit to using a certain proprietary software. So yes, you have this return in terms of the carbon credits that are paid for, but in doing so, there's this cost of having to use their software and enter all your data into it. And that is something worth considering as well, is whether or not it's going to lock you into some type of data sharing agreement. And then lastly, I mentioned Terra because they have a variety of programs where in the first one, they commit to selling the carbon credits, whereas in the second, they actually allow the producer to retain the carbon credit. And this is another very important distinction of whether or not the producer or the intermediary is the one who's going to hold on to the asset once it's generated, the asset being the carbon credit. So the main question here, it's exciting to say how much you could earn per acre per year, but the question that is really important as far as profitability is what do the costs look like. So we call these transaction costs, and some examples of this are the time involved with entering 5 years of farm management data. This is a really long and intense process, and that time it is worth something and worth considering. Another is the subscription that's required for using software, or the fact that you're locking yourself into this software. So potentially, if you choose a program and they have some software program that they require you to enter all your data into, let's say 10 years down the line, they go out of business, the company gets sold, you may have to now go through the same process, but completely different to the program. So these are costs that we discussed. Soil sampling, I mentioned before. Then also, some programs also have the producer pay for the verification costs. Nori is the only example of this that comes to mind. And this just means that some individual has to go and make sure that the practice is actually adopted. And the producer is going to bear that cost in that case. So all this to say, producers currently thinking about carbon credits, or if you're an investor who's thinking about, is this something that I want to use to diversify my portfolio, or if you're just wondering where is this market going, one of the questions I think that's helpful to ask is, what are some of the pros and cons of joining a carbon program now? What does the market currently look like, and is it advantageous to participate now? This is a good measure of how long we think this market is going to persist and how mature we think it is. So let's start with on the pro side. We know right now that the market is functioning and producers are getting paid for. And Anecdotally, I've talked to several producers in Kansas who have talked about the payments for getting it, and they are significant in some cases. Also, right now, both types of these programs exist. So you can sign up for either a payment for practice or a payment for carbon sequestered program, and that may not always be the case. We get much better at quantifying how much carbon is sequestered. It could be that payment for practices programs fall by the wayside. The other pro that I always like to mention is that there are other benefits of these practices being adopted, like agronomic benefits to your soil, or in many cases, cover crops are used to as grazing for livestock as well. And then lastly, sometimes programs have a discount for products from the parent company. So Bayer, for instance, if you're in their carbon program, I think offers a discount on some of their seed and pesticide, which given current costs could be a very useful thing to have. On the con side, though, this can be a pretty significant commitment. Contract length, the shortest one I know of is 5 years. There may be a couple now that are year to year. And what happens if, let's say, the price of glyphosate keeps going up and you've committed to cover cropping? That can be very difficult. And so breaking the contract also is going to have consequences, and this is something to think about. And then finally, carbon prices right now, this market in the US is very new. And so the price right now, $15 per ton, could rise in the future, and perhaps you miss out on the benefits of that increase. Again, this goes back to one of the questions that I think is really important. The first one here is who owns the credits? So in some programs, the credits are produced by the producer, but ultimately they're owned by the intermediary, who then sells them, and compensation for the producer is based on what they think the expected return is going to be. In other cases, the producer actually holds on to the credit at the end of the day, and the intermediary essentially gets the commission off the sale. In this case, the producer may be holding on to an extremely risky asset. Right? If this isn't the first time we've had a voluntary carbon market in the US, there's one, Chicago Climate Exchange in 2007, 2010. That ultimately collapsed. And so you don't want to be a producer who's holding on to a whole bunch of carbon credits that suddenly are worth nothing, or whose price drops precipitously. Second is what happens with my management data. So I mentioned you have to input sometimes 5 years of data. For a producer, that can be their competitive advantage, right? How they're managing their land translates into the profitability of their operation. And so you want to be assured that the data is being used for carbon quantification and isn't going to be shared with other parties or potentially used for other purposes. So there are programs like Ag Data Transparent, which look into things like this. And then finally, just asking about the contract length for the reasons I mentioned before. If it becomes prohibitively expensive to keep doing one of these practices, what's going to happen if you have to break that contract? The last thing I'll conclude on, and then we can open it up for questions and discussion, is to just talk a little bit about where things might be headed. So right now in Congress, I think it passed the Senate and sent it to the House. I'll have to double check that. Is the Growing Climate Solutions Act of 2022. And this would authorize the USDA to essentially facilitate the current structure of the market. So they aren't trying to make this a regulated compliance market. Instead, this would essentially allow the USDA to create programs that help deal with some concerns like the variability in quantification protocols. So even though this isn't, formal regulation of the market, if this act passed, I think we would expect to see the price of carbon credits rise because the USDA is facilitating some type of quality assessment of credits. The other thing is carbon dioxide doesn't really care where countries' boundaries end. So carbon dioxide that's emitted in Europe could make its way across the globe to the US and be sequestered in the soil here. But the way that the markets currently exist is a lot of them are national. So what this means is that you can have very different prices for carbon in different areas. So the EU, for instance, futures trading around $80 per ton of CO2, which is more than 4 times what we're seeing in the US. So if there's a possibility to market carbon credits generated here in the US abroad, the return to those carbon credits would be much greater. And lastly, is we also keep seeing new organizations pop up. So I mentioned Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. They have pilot projects in a lot of different states, and they're bundling carbon sequestration with other ecosystem services as well. I do see a question in the chat. I'll read that out, and at this point, yeah, we'll open things up to questions and discussion. This is a question about data security. So, question of are the current laws on the books keeping up with the technical advancements of all this data gathering? That's a great question. So the data gathering and sharing is going to be a component of the contract that producers sign. So really important that we emphasize reading these contracts to fine-tooth comb, because I guess the short answer would be that the contract, right, is going to be the law in this case, right? So for some organizations, they'll have a statement that says they can share the data with any of their subsidiary companies or partners that they have a financial interest in, which is a really broad statement. That type of statement to me is something that would be concerning, right? Other companies will say something explicitly that says this data can only be used for the purposes of quantifying carbon sequestration in this area and improving the model's performance. That is a description of data sharing that to me is more acceptable, right? Because they're saying how the data is going to be used and that it isn't going to be shared or used for other purposes. Does that answer the question? Okay, great. Any other questions or comments? One other thing I'll say about laws and concerns about data sharing is that this is something that Kansas State is thinking about working on in the future. Robin Reed, who works a lot with extension services, has talked about perhaps doing some type of workshop, including lawyers as well, looking at some of these contracts. So this is something that, given just broader discussions about agricultural data and its commodification, that is certainly on people's radar.
Micah, oh, we do have another question. Micah, would you like to read that from the chat box?
Sure. Question is, what are the international requirements for all countries to play a role in reducing the effects of climate change? Right now, there are the Paris Climate Accords, and there's the Kyoto Protocol as well, which are these large international commitments that were made by countries to reduce their carbon emissions by a certain amount. However, those to date have lacked a enforcement mechanism. So if a country is not meeting the commitments that it made, there haven't been any measures taken to penalize that country or hold them to the commitments being made. So again, that's why that isn't always the case. So in the EU, for instance, they have a compliance market. So within the EU, there is a cap on emissions, right? And if you want to emit more, then you have to buy carbon sequestration credits to offset those emissions. That is not the case internationally. And so in places like the US, that's why a voluntary market exists like this, where companies are deciding to offset their emissions, but it isn't because they're being held to some type of regulation that was put out by the EPA. Instead, it's because their stakeholders or their shareholders, in many cases, are holding them to some type of standard and saying, you know, we're going to own stock in this company. We want to, see a company that is reducing their emissions. And then the follow-up that in developing countries, these requirements cannot be implemented due to economic problems. So this is another part of this discussion, right, about who kind of bears the burden of reducing emissions. And yes, it can be the case that reducing emissions is a lot more costly in developing countries. So imposing those restrictions on developing countries may hinder their economic development because it's imposing additional costs. So yeah, this is a great comment and definitely a part of the broad discussions about international climate policy. No problem. Any other questions, comments?
Micah, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Do you know of one central resource, either USDA, KDA, research and extension, where producers can navigate on their own some of the information that you've provided and understand more thoroughly in a way that they can, click and research on their own? Do we have, is there a central resource for producers, or is it kind of just navigating through each individual company's offerings?
So right now, I know of one article that has made a very informative chart of different companies and the requirements for participating in their program. I can perhaps put that in the chat right now. There's also Ag Manager, Kansas State's repository of extension materials. Some of the presentations I've given in the past and the materials from them are on Ag Manager, and within those are some links to some of these different materials. Let me find the paper that I am thinking of. There's two of them. These are by Alejandro Plastina and one of his graduate students. Oh, I think that's the wrong image. Here we go. So in there are two articles by Alejandro Plastina, and one of them is kind of the chart of the different programs and some of their features and concerns, and then the other is how the process actually works. So diagrams of who's generating the credits, how they're being compensated, and the flow of information. And make sure that, yes, so the how to grow and sell carbon credits file is the one which contains the chart of the different companies. So that's going to have a variety of different intermediaries like Indigo, Nori, the requirements for participation, how payment is dispensed and when. And then the other one, how do data and payments flow, is going to contain those charts that show how producers' data circulates, who's shared with, and then the flow of payments as a result.
And for anyone who needs access to those, if you're tuning in from a mobile device or you're unable to download those right now from the chat box, feel free to contact me. I have downloaded them and I can send you an email with those PDFs.
Let me see if I can, go ahead.
Go ahead, Micah.
I'm just gonna see if I can find the link to the presentation, which is going to contain a lot of the same information, but Ag Manager is just a great resource in general for materials. Most of it is tailored to the Kansas context, but it should be widely applicable as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Micah. Does anyone else have any questions for Micah? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have just a few slides left.